Hey there, this is Steve Kimes, pastor of Eugene Mennonite Church, and we're still talking about some stories of ancient Anabaptists. And once again, Anabaptists aren't people who hate baptism. It's people who actually think that baptism should be done by believers. This is the third one in the series, and they kind of fit together. They kind of tell a story together. So you might want to look for the other two, Anabaptist Basics 1, Anabaptist Basics 2. This is the third one. I said that. And so so let's figure this out. All right, let's do this thing. So 16th century Europe, and Anabaptists are being killed all over Europe. You got Anabaptists say that people, infants shouldn't be baptized, so we're going to baptize everyone who wants to be baptized, who makes the choice to be baptized, and those are the people who actually believe, and baptism is for believers, not for babies. But, magistrates and princes and councils didn't like that at all. They thought that was actually a horrible idea because all of their citizenship identifications are baptism certificates that are done when people are infants. So they didn't like this. They didn't like people going around basically saying, let's burn all of our IDs. So they killed them. They killed them all over Europe, everywhere. They were considered to be dangerous criminals, and all that. So they killed them all. Now, this went on for a number of decades, and a certain Anabaptists said, we don't like this. We're not really comfortable with being killed all the time and being persecuted and having to run from place to place. We're just done with this. They wanted a safe place. They wanted a kingdom of Anabaptists that would be safe from the rest of Europe. They didn't necessarily want to destroy all of Europe. They didn't want to burn it down, but they did want a place that they could call their own. So they chose a city called Munster. A certain group of Anabaptists chose the city of Munster. They got a bunch of them together, and they took over that town. And so as they fought to defend the city from the army attacking them, because of course there was an army attacking them, they took over the city, and everyone around said, oh no, Anabaptists are taking over. The communists are coming. They're taking over all of our people. So they're defending. They said, we would really prefer it if armies kind of went somewhere else. And so we want to incent Anabaptist revolution in other places, so that way other people can get armies, and not just us. And so they went to a man named Jan van Grielen, and they said, hey, Jan, how about you go to the Netherlands and try to take over a city over there? Jan said, oh yeah, I'm ready to do anything for the cause. So they sent him to the Netherlands to stir up revolution there, and so to distract people's attention from Munster. So Jan tried his best to do that, and most Anabaptists are just like, Jan, I don't know about you. But he was able to gather about 300 Anabaptists, young Anabaptists, and say, let's go take over this monastery. So they took over the monastery, and an army did come. And it took them a couple of weeks, 4 separate attacks to actually get the monastery back, but they got it back. In the meanwhile, all of the people who Jan collected, they all died. All these folks, all these young people died. Jan, however, escaped through the back route, and he got away. One of those people, one of those 300 that was collected and killed, was a guy named Peter Simons. He was just your common revolutionary Anabaptist, except for one thing, that his brother is this guy named Menno Simons. And Menno Simons became one of the most famous of the early Anabaptists. Menno Simons basically became famous for a couple reasons. First of all, he was really good at hiding. He was great at hiding, and so he taught all over Europe. He went to lots of different places, but he always was able to hide instead of getting killed. So that meant he lived longer than a lot of the other early Anabaptists. He wasn't one of the early Anabaptists. He came a little bit later. And also, he wrote a lot. You can get a volume of the complete works of Menno Simons, and it's a hefty volume. It weighs a lot, and so you want to take that to class every day, and you're going to get a sore back. So he wrote a lot of stuff. But the thing is that the surprising thing to me is that he became an Anabaptist at all. I mean, look what happened to his brother. So he sees that his brother gets killed because he's hanging out with Anabaptists. But what really happened is that he looked at the Anabaptists and he saw that Jan, when he first came to the Anabaptists in the Netherlands, all of the leadership of the Anabaptists rejected what it was that Jan was saying. All of them. They all rejected it. And so there were some young Anabaptists who agreed to do it, rejecting their elders. And Menno actually chose to become a part of the Anabaptists who said, no, we're going to reject violence and we're going to reject persecuting in face of persecution. So Menno, one of the many things that Menno wrote is he wrote Peter, not his brother Peter, although I kind of wonder if he didn't feel like there was a connection there. But Peter, the Bible Peter, was commanded to sheath his sword. And all Christians are commanded to love their enemies. So tell me, how can a Christian defend scripturally retaliation, rebellion, war, striking, slaying, torturing, stealing, robbing, plundering, and burning cities and conquering countries? The implication is, no, you can't be a Christian and do those things. You can't be following Jesus and doing those things. Let's make it really clear that the Anabaptists had every right to be violent against the cities and peoples that were attacking them. If that was happening to us, we would want to defend ourselves. Anybody would want to defend themselves. You have a whole nation coming after you, killing your friends, killing your family, persecuting you, forcing you to move, forcing you to live miserable lives. Yeah, no, it makes sense that you'd want to pursue them back, that you'd want to get back at them. Thousands of people were being killed for doing nothing more wrong than holding to a different religious conviction. They didn't attack anyone. They didn't harm anyone. They didn't retaliate even for the tortures and deaths for both men and women. And yet, it is the most natural thing in the world to say, well, you killed my brother, or you killed my mother. I'm going to come after you. Only it's the most natural thing in the world. But they didn't. They didn't do it at all. They did that because of their beliefs in the Bible. Remember, we said in the first one that Anabaptists were different because they held to a belief that Jesus comes first. So there may be Old Testament passages that tell people to go to war, and there may be other parts in the Bible that seem to indicate that self-defense and harming another in self-defense is totally fine. But they said, but in Jesus, you really can't hold that. So Mark 3:5. It says, which is lawful on the Sabbath, Jesus said, to do good or evil, to save life or to kill. And Jesus said, doing good is the opposite of killing. Doing good is the opposite of harming other people. Matthew 26:52. The one who lives by the sword, says Jesus, will die by the sword. And Luke chapter 6, very famous passage, says, you who are listening, I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks from you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. We can ask this, well, who is our enemy? Who is it? Now, in the definitions that Jesus is giving, especially in Luke chapter 6, an enemy is a person who is attempting to harm you in one way or the other, whether it be actual physical violence or something like that. But it also means people who are trying to ostracize you or separate from you, or just to be mean to you because you are different from them. So those are people who are enemies. So what is love in this? Well, first of all, according to Mark, to love someone, to do good, is not to harm them, not to kill them. So that means if you are loving someone, you cannot love them and harm them. You cannot love them and kill them. Those two things just don't go together. Not possible. But also, if you look in the general context of the gospel, it means that you are going to meet their needs when they need help. And the early Anabaptists read these texts and many others in the New Testament and realized that Jesus' command was firm. We are not to harm others, even if they harm us. Now, there are some people, some modern scholars, who believe that Jesus must have promoted violence. They're saying, well, these passages aren't really the real Jesus. The real Jesus must have promoted violence. And their argument goes like this, that Jesus was a Messiah figure. And all the Messiah figures of the first century were insurgents and violent, which is why they were crucified. So Jesus was a Messiah figure and he was crucified. Therefore, he must have encouraged violence. So they pull some passages out of their context, like Jesus saying, sell your cloak and buy a sword, or other implications that the temple would be destroyed as proof of his violence, saying, see, he's a violent guy. But the fact is that these passages do not speak of doing violence, but of God fulfilling the scriptures in Jesus. For 300 years, the teaching of Jesus' followers was consistent, that the life in Jesus allows that we would be persecuted, but we can persecute no one in return. So we speak against injustice of the state, but we do not take up arms against the state. And the entire church held to those principles until around 300 AD, and then they started to compromise that. Why did they compromise that? Because they wanted to participate in empire. In the last video, I talked about that the one rule of Jesus is love. And I just was seeing the news just now that there are 4 women in Arizona, 4 Arizona women that have been they're being punished for leaving water and food for immigrants who are coming across the border. And empire, when an empire wants to grow and an empire wants to protect itself, then they will make it illegal to love. They'll make it illegal to stand with the people who are in need. And the church has always been with people who are in need. And they've always been people who said, I'm not going to persecute my enemies. Empire does. And when we say, well, the will of the church or the will of God is the same as the will of empire, then we will make love illegal. But the fact is that when we make love illegal, when love is opposed to our policies, when love is opposed to the way we do things, then that is the point in which we become criminals in God's eyes. So it's amazing that 1,200 years later, with a church that has been fully enmeshed in empire for 1,200 years, that a group took their study of the early Christian scripture so seriously that they determined that the true way of Jesus is the path of harming no one, of loving their enemies. They understood that Jesus was the true warrior who sacrificed only himself for the kingdom and not somebody else. Anabaptists, along with other Christian groups such as the Quakers, that hold to this doctrine of peace to this day. They say that if you are a follower of Jesus, you do not participate in war. If you are a follower of Jesus, you do not harm anyone, because that's not our place. Obviously, that is not the majority Christian Christian point of view. And that's because most Christians think that empire helps protect Christianity. But that's not the way of Jesus. It's not the way that Jesus went. One of the early Anabaptists is a guy named Dirk Willems. And he has a story. If there's any story that's famous in Anabaptists that a lot of people know about, it's Dirk Willems. And everybody's like, what's Dirk Willems? Well, there's this picture of this guy, and he's kind of going over and trying to get this other guy out of a frozen river, wood cutting. And that's of a very early Anabaptist named Dirk Willems. And Dirk Willems is one of these guys that went out and preached baptism. He says, hey, everybody get baptized. And so a community caught him and took him and put him in jail. And then he found a way out. He snuck through his way out, and he's running. But the bailiff is right there and is chasing after him. So they chase down the road, and Dirk Willems says, hey, I know what I'll do. I'll go across this frozen river right here, because that's a brilliant idea. Everyone should do this. So he goes across the frozen river. He's heading across, and the bailiff is following straight after him. And the bailiff falls through light ice into the river. Somehow Dirk missed it. Don't know how that happened, but there it is. So Dirk is running, guy is in the river, and then Dirk stops. Now the thing is that if it were me and I was running from the bailiff, I don't think I would hear anything. I don't think I'd pay attention. I'd be really focused on trying to get away, but I don't think I would pay attention that someone just fell in the river. I don't know. Maybe it's noisy when somebody falls in the river, like, help, help, help. I don't know. Anyway, so I might not have gone back, but Dirk did. Dirk turned around and went back and helped this guy, pulled him out of the river, saved his life, because he wouldn't have lived. In the meantime, so the bailiff is like, thank you, thank you, thank you. In the meantime, on the side of the thing, there are magistrates, and they are heads of the town, and they're calling to the bailiff saying, well, arrest this guy, arrest him. The bailiff said, this guy just saved my life. You want me to arrest him? And they said, you either arrest him or we're going to persecute your family. We're going to persecute you and your family, so you better arrest him. So he arrested him because he didn't feel like he had any choice. And then he pulled him back, and then Dirk was put on trial, and he was killed. Now, the fact is that Dirk knew that if he got caught, he would be killed. And he knew that if he went back to save that guy, that he would likely be caught and be killed. But he did it anyway. He did it anyway because that's the way that Jesus wanted to. That's the way Jesus wanted him to do. He did it because of obedience, because obeying Jesus is more important than anything else. It's interesting that just like the early Christians, the early Anabaptists could have risen against the people of Europe, against the rulers of Europe that were persecuting them. Thousands of people ended up getting baptized, and they could have really done a lot of things, but the fact is that the basic commitment of an Anabaptist is a person who follows Jesus, and to follow Jesus means that we are going to sacrifice ourselves, not harm other people. And so, they're real heroes of Jesus. This weekend is January 20th in 2019. And this weekend is World Anabaptist Fellowship Day. We celebrate the fact that we're not just a small group of people who believe in Anabaptist principles. We're part of a group of millions of people. Millions of people call themselves, 1 million people call themselves Anabaptist around the world. And there are literally millions of people in all denominations who follow Anabaptist principles, who believe in the Anabaptist principles, the Anabaptist principles that we've talked about. And we've really talked about 6 principles in the 3 talks. There you go. 6 principles? I don't remember. 1 is an interpretation of the Bible. We talked about how interpretation of the Bible is done by community and it focuses on Jesus. Secondly is believers' baptism, that people get baptized as believers, that they become saved, or they become a part of Jesus by making a choice to do it. The third thing we talked about was that Anabaptists believe in two kingdom theology, that there's a difference between what government does and what church does. The church needs to follow the rule of God, which is love, and government doesn't follow the rule of love, and we choose to follow love no matter what. The fourth one is persecution, that the church will be persecuted. It's a promise, not a possibility, but the church absolutely, if they're doing what Jesus wants them to, they will be persecuted. Fifth thing is that Anabaptists believe in loving their enemies. Jesus told us to love our enemies. That's what we're going to do. And then the sixth thing is Anabaptists believe in peace. We are a peace church. We are not going to harm others, no matter who they are. This is a universal principle, not just that we don't harm enemies, but that we are going to love everyone and try to encourage peace and justice in the world. Those are 6 principles. There are more. In fact, actually, I have a blog called 25 Anabaptist Distinctives, and it goes through 25 things that early Anabaptists believe. I don't actually believe in all of them, but there are a bunch of things that make a person Anabaptist back in the 16th century. Now, and so there are millions of people throughout the world that believe in these principles, who follow Jesus in these ways. And we celebrate, and we are all a part of the same community. And this is a day that we celebrate that. Now, this weekend also happens to be a weekend that we celebrate somebody else. That is Martin Luther King Jr. And so we celebrate the civil rights movement, especially the part of the civil rights movement that held to principles of peace that Martin Luther King Jr. held. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, it isn't a real civil rights movement unless they hold to principles of peace. And I'd have to say, no, that's not true. The fact is that if a group has been oppressed, has been pushed down, has been set aside, whose rights have been ignored for centuries, they have a right. They have a human right to be furious, to be angry, to fight back, and to battle back in order to stand up and say, no, we are tired of dying. We are tired of being incarcerated. We are tired of this. They have that right. It is only people who follow Jesus, who have the Spirit of God, who are going to be led in the way of peace, no matter what it costs. I have a friend of mine, and he says, yeah, no, I definitely believe in peace, but I'd only believe it because I believe that there's a resurrection, because frankly, that's a pretty big sacrifice to make, to not harm your enemies unless there's a God and there's a second chance at life. And I have to agree, I mean, it's just not for everybody, and so the normal, human, natural way is to get revenge, to say, no, you did this to me, so I'm going to do this to you. The way of the Spirit is the way of love. The way of the Spirit is to allow people to do things, or not to allow people, but people do things to you, and you are not going to get back at them. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. taught. And he showed that this is not only a principle that is a Jesus follower principle, but a principle that can change the world. Now, he learned that, of course, from Gandhi. He went to Gandhi and he learned the principles of nonviolence from Gandhi. Where did Gandhi learn those principles? He learned those principles from, of all people, Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace. He didn't learn it from War and Peace, mind you. Not going to learn nonviolent principles from War and Peace, but Leo Tolstoy wrote another book called The Kingdom of God is Within You, which talks about two basic principles. One, not participating in war or not doing harm to your enemies, and the other is living in community. And he learned these principles by observing the Mennonites and Anabaptists that were in his community in Russia. Well, that doesn't mean he had big talks with them. He didn't, but he observed them. And he realized that this is a way to understand what Jesus was saying, and he wrote his book uh, along along those lines. And all of these people have in common that they read Jesus and they understood that Jesus was saying that when he said love your enemies, that means not participating in war. That means not giving back to them what they gave to you. And so there are all these people, there's even more and more today that see Jesus clearly in this way, that understand Jesus in this way. The answer to destruction is not destruction. Never has been. Doesn't work very well, because the only thing that when you destroy your enemy, all you're doing is setting up another person who believes in destruction. But rather it is standing for justice and peace, no matter what the consequence. And that's what we're talking about for Anabaptism this time. So we'll be back later, and may the Lord bless you and keep you and give you